I bring greetings to you all from Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, organization which is a kind of 14 members countries are part of that, and I'm as their executive council member. I'm so glad and fortunate to be here, part of this very important program, and I'll try my best to bring from my own context kind of a reflection. As I come from Asia continent-wise, so in Asia, if you see most of the Asian countries, the relationship between CSOs and government is seen as very critical. And the term we use for that is shrinking space. It's a kind of our space, what as CSOs we had, is shrinking. But one cannot deny that CSO's role through dialogue, advocacy, lobby with government has impact on the existing good governance and democracy. The ground realities to be framed at policy level, and policy level matters to be implemented at grassroots level. In both ways, CSOs plays an important role in it. There are different category of CSOs or various forms or roles of CSOs. I'm not going into that, but it's always, when I think of the organization which I belong to, it's a larger organization, AIPP, Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact. It's a people's movement platform for solidarity and cooperation for indigenous people's rights. And it's mainly to promote and to defend the indigenous people's rights and human rights, sustainable development and management of resources and environmental issues to protect. These are something which relate with many issues which we all human beings are connected. So I have some experiences, but since I also come from a context, a larger, like India, which is also kind of in terms of cultural diversity, is a very good example of diverse ethnicity, cultures, languages, and religious practices. The geographical boundaries landscape has also helped many ethnic groups to develop their unique ways of life and cultures for coexistence. Their languages have nurtured the global, local, and traditional knowledge of these communities. And their cultural and religious practices have taught them to have reverence to coexist with the natural environment they live in it. There have been different dynasties that have ruled and shaped their polity and made history. The social movement and uprising and protest for change and reforms have been very prominent in different ethnic and cultural groups in different parts of India. The Brahmo Samaj movement was for equality in the Hindu religious practices in Bengal. In Punjab, Haryana, also the religious practices for Dalit sections to come together to reflect for their well-being. Birsa movement was also a movement for social reform through spiritual revival. Ultimately, language has played a major role in the whole discourse of social change and reforms, be it in the Bengal language movement or the Tamil movement for their distinct identity. In fact, India is a country of languages, as it is on the basis of the languages that the country been united as one. Maharashtra for Marathi speaking, Assam for Assamese speaking, and Kerala for Malayalam speaking so forth, like that states have named. But from the context of indigenous peoples, the tribal, aboriginal, as some sections were called, when we have the larger uniform system of administration that was brought by colonial system. India was broadly categorized as princely state, like general areas, partly excluded areas like 5th schedule, and fully excluded area like 6th schedule. Here, the language was not the main criteria, as there were different tribes, especially in both the excluded area. But it so happened that the state languages have been the ones that dominated. For example, in Gondwana area, Gondis should be the official language, but Hindi is a dominant language. Santhal Pargana, Santhali should be the dominant, that should be the official language, but Hindi is the language. So although we have the constitutional provisions and institutions to protect and promote indigenous and endangered languages, there is the issue of political will in the government and also the issue of self-determination in the whole governance system. Within indigenous, those Hinduized and those with the Western values, that is also kind of categorized. The indigenous or Adivasis, the term used, tribes, culture, have broadly speaking two major influencing factors there. One is Hinduized or Sanskritized, that's upward mobility, influence, and secondly, the Western is more like Western modernized influence. The main challenge, thus, among the indigenous people is to redefine their own path within these influences. Those who are more urban or semi-urban, and those in the village or rural life, it is within this context the question of language or Adivasi philosophy will give some clues. The indigenous or Adivasi tribes, as of today, largely after the independence of the country, are becoming divided into two kinds of groups. The urban or the semi-urban groups who have come up with the education and are in different kinds of jobs. There is another section largely called to be the rural or village-based section. They are the ones depending on rural economy, the agrarian society. This section is the one that has kept its language on customs and culture to large extent. They are also a rich source of local and traditional knowledge, which is cradled in their languages. The festivals and celebrations, the customary practices of their birth to death and religious practices come from philosophy that is different from the other institutional religions. The challenge is as more and more indigenous or Adivasi tribal people opt to go for urban way of life, which the modern education is catering, the importance of their own knowledge base and their language is becoming difficult to be taken forward. The modern development and the market economy is what is being one of them main cause for abandoning the rich values in the local and traditional knowledge of these communities. There are different aspects for this. The ideological aspect, that is the perspective of Adivasi or indigenous themselves, what they have adopted. Those who have adopted the Western ways or even the Sanskritized way of life, in both cases, the Adivasis are depriving themselves from their own Adivasi or indigenous origin. There are, we have like SDG goal 4, which is when we connect with our context. It's like indigenous people and in particular indigenous women and girls face many obstacles within the formal education system. At the same time, indigenous languages and knowledge systems are often not reflected in formal education. So SDG goal 4, we take this, I'm relating with this as how it is a kind of a connectivity with the indigenous communities. An opportunity to ensure inclusive, equitable, quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for indigenous children, youth, women, including indigenous persons with disabilities. As per the SDG goal 4.1, 4.2, 4.3, Equal access to all levels of education leading relevant and effective learning outcomes. This can be translated to ensure access of indigenous children and youth, and in particular indigenous girls, to all levels of education. This is to undertake educational reform to ensure relevance of children outcomes for indigenous children. The same as goal 4.7, knowledge and skills for sustainable development, including education for sustainable lifestyle, human rights, gender equality, appreciation of cultural diversity, and cultural's contribution to sustainable development. That means integration of indigenous people's knowledge, culture, languages in formal curricula, including for non-indigenous sectors of society. The same way when we see the UN RIP, that's a UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Article 14, which has good connection with this, that how indigenous people's rights are to establish and control their educational systems and institutions providing education in their own languages in a manner appropriate to their cultural methods of teaching and learning. It's also like indigenous individuals, particularly children, have the right to all levels and forms of education of the state without discrimination. That is, state shall, in conjunction with indigenous peoples, take effective measures in order for indigenous individuals, particularly children, including those living outside their communities, to have access, when possible, to an education in their own culture and provided in their own language. So these are the connecting to the indigenous context when we, in terms of cultural diversity, as we can connect it to, in a wider perspective, like cultural diversity and human rights, as without one cannot exist. And as rightly said, that the link between cultural diversity and human rights is like clearly established in Cultural Convention in Article 2.1, Cultural Diversity Convention. It is stated that cultural diversity can be protected and promoted only if human rights and fundamental freedoms are guaranteed. So I think along all these things, I feel that like organization, as I'm giving example that how it is bridging the gap between this policy and practice, as the AIPP is having these 48 members in 14 countries. So we all are involved in various themes, which I just shared. And at policy level, we are doing the advocacy and dialogue and lobby with the government. But at the same time, because of the shrinking space, we have limitations. But still, we are trying, and I think it's a very good example what we have in the global guide. I think it will in the future will be good to be implemented or translated at large where we belong to. So thank you.